Hello, this is Juliana Michaels and welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to share how I created this mixed media background using a letterpress technique that's really quite easy. All you need is an embossing folder, a die cutting machine, some sort of permanent waterproof ink, and some spray inks or ink pads in various colors. You can also create this effect with your dies, and I'll show you how to do that as well. I'm going to show how I add the color first, and once that's completed, I'll share about the letterpress technique. As you can see, I've got my die cutting machine ready to go, and I've already cut a piece of distress watercolor paper to 4 by 5 1/4 inches. I'm going to be using the Mosaic 3D embossing folder, but feel free to use any embossing folder you have on hand. Before I emboss the paper, I'm going to spritz it on both sides with some water until the paper is slightly damp. This will soften the paper and give you a more crisp image and help prevent the paper from cracking. Next, I'm going to place the panel inside the embossing folder, close the folder, and run it through my die cutting machine to emboss it. You might notice that I end up flipping the folder around and that I run the open end through the machine first. I find that with these 3D folders, they sometimes don't want to go through the machine if you try to feed them fold side first, and this is one of those folders. If you ever feel any resistance when trying to feed an embossing folder through your die cutting machine, try flipping it around like this and see if it works better for you. Look at that texture. It's really amazing how beautiful and deep the embossing is with these 3D embossing folders. You might also notice that the design is slightly darker than expected, and that is because I had some leftover ink on my embossing folder after practicing this technique. More on that in a minute. Now that the paper has been embossed, I'm going to add some color using Distress Oxide sprays. If you don't have these sprays, you could also use Distress Oxide ink pads. The first color I'm using is Speckled Egg, and I'm spraying it directly onto my craft mat. With the Oxide sprays, you want to remember to shake them until the mixing ball starts rattling so that the ink is fully blended. You can tell by turning the bottle upside down and looking to see that the ink is not stuck to the bottom of the bottle. Next, I spritz the ink with a little water and then begin dabbing the embossed paper into the ink. I'm not dabbing the entire panel. I'm pushing down on parts of it to pick up the ink here and there. I then spritz that with a little water and begin drying it with my heat tool. Once the ink is dry, I'm going to clean off my craft mat and repeat this process using brushed corduroy. As I mentioned earlier, you could also use Distress Oxide ink pads for this technique. To do this, you would simply smush the ink pad onto your craft mat, spritz it with water, and then dab the paper into the ink. So feel free to use your ink pads if you don't have the sprays. You could also mix the sprays and ink pads if you don't have all the colors in the spray or the ink. Here you'll notice that I'm adding the third color, Uncharted Mariner, onto the side of my craft mat and not cleaning off the brushed corduroy. That is because I think I might want to add more ink later on, so why waste all that good ink? As before, I'm repeating the same process of spraying the ink, spritzing it with water, and then dabbing the paper into the ink. After drying the ink, I do decide to add a bit more brushed corduroy, so I spritz it with a little bit of water and dab the paper into the ink. This time trying to pick up the ink in the areas where I want to add more of that color. Here I'm doing the same thing with the Uncharted Mariner. I continue with this process until I'm happy with how it looks. With the color added, now I'm going to move on to the fun part and do the letterpress technique. I've got my die cutting machine and the same embossing folder I used in the beginning. But before I do anything, I'm going to apply black soot archival ink to the side that will push down into the paper and create the embossed design. This is typically the side of the folder that is the front side or the one with the printing on it. I recommend using a permanent waterproof ink such as archival ink so that you get a good impression. Before I place the paper into the embossing folder, I need to line it up in the exact same place as when I first embossed it. I like to place it on the opposite side and slide it around until it falls into place. Once it's lined up, I'm going to carefully hold the paper in place as I close the embossing folder. I continue to hold it carefully so the paper doesn't slide around and run it through my die cutting machine. And here's what the letterpress effect looks like. The ink has been transferred from the embossing folder onto the paper. I really love how it makes the texture from the embossing folder stand out. Another thing, in case you were wondering, if you use archival ink and want to clean the ink off of the embossing folder, I recommend using archival ink cleaner and then follow that up with a good scrub using soap, water, and an old toothbrush. This will remove any ink or residue left from the cleaner so that you don't unintentionally transfer any of that to a future project. Now for the rest of the card. The die-cut leaves and stems are from the Brushstroke Flowers Mini Thinlits die set. I cut the leaves from distressed watercolor paper. I spritzed some of them with Uncharted Mariner Distress Spray Stain, and the others I stamped with black soot archival ink and the newsprint image from the Tim Holtz Newsprint and Type stamp set. I inked the edges of these with walnut stain distress ink. I cut the stems from blackout craft stock and sanded them with a distress sanding disc. If you leave the die cut in the paper you cut it from and sand it, you don't have to worry about the small die cut tearing as you try to sand. This also gives you something to hold on to. As for the rest of the design, I used the heart shapes from the Tim Holtz Wood Slice Thinlits dies. I created the largest die by cutting the largest layer from blackout craft stock and sanding the edges with a distress sanding disc. I then cut the next layer from white cardstock and stamped it with the newsprint image from the Tim Holtz Newsprint and Type stamp set using black soot archival ink. I then inked the edges with walnut stain distress ink. For the smaller heart, I'm using the heart from the Wood Slice Thinlits and another letterpress technique. This die has areas on it that are made to emboss the design into the paper. Before you continue, make sure to clean the die with some isopropyl alcohol to remove any residue from the manufacturing process, and be careful rubbing over the surface so that you don't cut yourself. Next, I use a brayer to apply black soot archival ink directly to the die until it is completely covered. This die is meant to emboss the wood rings into the paper. By applying ink to this part of the die, we will be able to transfer that ink onto the paper during the die cutting process. I now have my die cutting machine set up to die cut like normal. I then carefully pick up the die and place it onto a piece of distressed white heavy stock and run it through my die cutting machine. And voila, another way to letterpress, this time with a die. After creating this heart, I layered it onto a piece of blackout craft stock that I cut using the wood slice dies, and as before I sanded the edges. I then adhered all of the pieces to the background panel. To complete the card, I adhered the background to a piece of blackout craft stock with the edges sanded, and then added a sentiment from the Tim Holtz Metallic Sticker Book. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed learning how I created this card and how to create letterpress effects with embossing folders and dies. Until next time. Thanks so much for watching. I'm truly grateful for you. I was wondering if you could do me a quick favor and subscribe to my channel or leave me a thumbs up or a comment. If you're feeling extra generous, I'd love for you to share about my channel with your friends. All of these things help out us YouTubers so much, and it would mean so much to me to have your support.